Hey people, just Siobhan here, quickly jumping in at the start of the show to remind you that we have a new sponsor, and that is the Animal Publics book series, which is part of the University of Sydney Press. So the wise people at the University of Sydney have decided to have an animal studies focused series. It's called Animal Publics. It has fantastic series editors in Fiona Probyn-Rapsey and Melissa Boyd. It is the hot place to publish your animal studies work, and also a good place to go and look if you want to stock up on animal studies publications for your institution. So check out Animal Publics, part of the University of Sydney Press. This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Well, ASA is, in my opinion, a really good organisation and one that you should consider supporting. One way you can support ASA is by becoming a member. It's very, very affordable to be a member. It's around $60 Australian for a year's membership if you are waged. You can also support them by liking and following them on their Facebook page, and you can also check out their website. So lots of different ways in which you can support ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Well, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you from the 2019 ASA conference called Decolonising Animals, which is taking place in the beautiful city of Christchurch in the lovely country of New Zealand, where the world's most wonderful people live. And I'm really lucky to have another guest on this program who is someone here to attend the Decolonising Animals conference, someone who I wouldn't normally have the opportunity to interview. So this week I'm joined by Natalie Khazaal. Natalie is Associate Professor in the Department of International Studies at Texas A&M University. She's motioning at me now. Where are you based, Natalie?
I'm actually an Assistant Professor at Georgia Tech.
Oh, okay. You're an Assistant Professor at Georgia Tech. Well, Texas A&M is trying to claim you as their own on the internet.
I used to be there, but I moved to Georgia Tech in Atlanta, Georgia.
Okay. So if you are looking for Natalie, which you no doubt will be as soon as you've heard all about her wonderful research, you need to go to Georgia. Is that right?
Right.
Georgia. Is it just Georgia University?
Georgia Institute of Technology.
Georgia Institute of Technology. But nevertheless, today we're going to discuss her article, An Angry Cow is Not a Good Eating Experience, How US and Spanish Media Are Shifting from Crude to Camouflaged Speciesism and Concealing Nonhuman Perspectives. So that might be the longest title we've had on the program yet. And that came out in the journal Journalism Studies in 2014. And we have to give a shout out to Natalie's co-author, whose name I've got a very funny feeling I'm not going to be able to pronounce.
Nuria Almiron.
There you go. Welcome to the podcast, Natalie.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to talk about this research, especially in such an amazing conference that I'm attending right now. A fantastic time here.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, what inspired you to do this piece of work?
What inspired me was basically the fact that we have really developed a lot of good organizations that do activism on behalf of animals, do animal rights, in many countries, especially in the West. But we don't quite have as much animal academic research that these activists can use in their own activism, and especially in the field that I'm working, which is media studies for the most part and cultural studies. So my co-author and I were very excited when we met each other. We met each other at another conference in fact, and we decided to work together towards developing and helping develop a new and an up-and-coming field called critical animal and media studies. So that was basically the inspiration. Basically, as an activist, you do need the support of research, since our world today is primarily, uses research as justification and as authority to make any claims about anything. So that was very significant for me. Why, for example, feminism has developed several generations of scholarships, and they do use critical approaches, why other types of studies use many different approaches and spill over, and in critical studies, critical media and animal studies, we don't really have that much developed in terms of research. So that was basically the main inspiration to go out there and to, if it doesn't exist, help it get going, and that would attract other people to continue working in it.
Wonderful. Well, one of the big themes of the research is speciesism. Could you tell listeners in your own word what speciesism is?
Right. So think of speciesism as a type of racism, but racism would be against another human race. Speciesism would be racism against another species. So it has very similar ways of attracting, permeating societies, if you will, just like racism, and promoting the ideology through different types of media, for example, or other different practices.
So you use a critical discourse analysis process to do your analysis. Can you also tell listeners what that is and how you use it?
Right. So critical discourse analysis basically means that we are looking at the ways in which language is used in order to justify oppression. So that's basically the way we apply it, and that's why it's called critical. It's an analysis of discourse or of language that it's out there, but in a critical way, not just analysis for any other sake, but analysis which focuses really on seeing how dominating groups in society use language and discourse and culture that is shaped through language and communicated through language in order to oppress other sectors of society, and how very often that is not a direct coercion, but it is something that the oppressed groups willingly accept for reasons that have nothing to do with the oppression, for reasons that are, distracting them from really standing up against oppression.
Excuse me. So there's a subtlety there. What were you looking for when you did your analysis?
So basically, we were interested to see and compare how the discourse around speciesism in mass media, whether it supported, especially we were looking at newspapers, whether newspapers supported speciesism in their articles or whether they challenged it. And we were also interested in seeing whether there is a difference between the United States and Spain in the way newspapers either supported or challenged speciesism. So these were our three main goals.
Great. And what did you find?
We found something that is extremely interesting. So basically, two major findings. One of them was that the main topic of the majority of the articles that we explored, and our main kind of sample was upwards of 50,000, but we narrowed it down to a few hundred, and then we selected 60 articles that were the most precious sample. So the main topic in the majority of these articles was agricultural regulation, and these were articles that dealt with animal issues. So instead of describing the situations of animals and their maybe their feelings, their interest in life and not suffering, and etc. Instead of taking the perspective of the animal and talking about the animal's well-being and rights, the majority of these articles took the perspective of agriculture, basically business, and they were talking about regulation. So the dominant frame, or in other words, the angle through which they were telling the story of regulation, was that of profit. So what interested them was whether there was profit or whether profit suffered, and to a lesser degree whether a particular type of agriculture, animal agriculture, was going to affect human health positively or negatively. So everything was circled around profit or human health. We didn't really find that many articles, if at all, that some presented, but very, very few presented kind of a pro-animal point of view. So that was the first major finding, and that was not particularly something that we didn't expect. The thing that was more or less interesting for us to find out is that there was a pronounced difference between the discourse, the way speciesism was used and instrumentalized in the American medium, which was the New York Times, and in the Spanish medium, El País, which is the equivalent of the New York Times in Spain. So this is like the major newspapers of these two countries. So we discovered that in Spain, the overwhelming majority of the articles used what we called crude speciesism. In other words, this is very open speciesism, and it uses as a main technique fear-mongering. It wants to scare readers in very particular ways. For instance, scare them that the prices of meat, because of animal regulation and animal welfare and animal rights, is going to skyrocket, and that would be bad for the pocket. And the farmers are going to have to pay more for animal welfare, and so they will basically add on to the price of meat and animal products. So that was their major scare tactic. In the New York Times, by comparison, that part existed, but it was not as pronounced as in El País. And there was a second part that was almost completely missing in El País, and that was what we called camouflaged speciesism. In other words, this is no longer the speciesism that is crude in your face, speciesism. I'll talk about it in more details in just a second, but speciesism that basically wants to not scare the reader, but reassure the reader that speciesism is okay, that eating meat is ethical. So yeah, I can go in more details for both of them.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So in both cases, we have speciesism being played out in the media, but they're being expressed in different ways. Did you have a chance to think about why that might be? Is that culturally informed, or why would they be playing out differently in these two countries?
So the main reason why we think this was different is because in the United States, animal rights has had a long history. And there was a lot of animal rights organizations. It is a rich field. It has a lot of activism. In Spain, by contrast, there is very little, and that at that time, we wrote it about 5-6 years ago, at that time as well, there was really very little animal rights activism and veganism, and so the country really did not recognize some of the debates that in the United States have been brought up and raised by animal rights activists, and because of these debates, because of raising them, newspapers such as the New York Times, as well as animal agriculture, has had time to regroup, to rethink their strategy. And now, instead of being crude in your face, they're trying to basically dress up speciesism in nice clothes and sell you the same product, but just packaged differently.
So is that more troublesome, do you think, the kind of the vegan washing?
Absolutely. Camouflaged speciesism is a lot more difficult to find out. Let me give you an example, and that's why it's a lot more dangerous, because people don't spot it. Let me give you an example. For instance, with crude speciesism would be a strategy of objectifying, like outright objectifying. For instance, calling animals heads. He owns 30 heads, or calling them units. Or, for instance, saying that for instance, the law considers foie gras to be cruel. So the word considers is kind of like hedging, but it's more open. On the other hand, the camouflaged speciesism presents very happy stories that have happy ending, that want to reassure the audiences that everything is fine and it's okay to eat meat, for instance, and that there are new heroes that we should appreciate. For instance, they very often praise big business, and they write animal rights activism that is the driver of all the achievements. They write them off of the history of these achievements. For instance, articles say, oh my God, OMG, McDonald's does the right thing. Whereas it's not really McDonald's who does the right thing. McDonald's has no other option, because animal rights activism have put them in a position where they either have to admit that they have these horrible practices and suffer losing clients, or they have to do something about it. Yet it's a recasting the whole thing as a happy story. Another example would be, for instance, with names. A lot of these animals that the newspapers, the New York Times talked about, were given names, and the article writer specifically wanted to mention the name, because the name is in a way a mechanism to signify that somebody is an individual. And when we do that, it is usually a mechanism to acknowledge the subjectivity of that person. However, that was a bait and switch. So they want to acknowledge, they want to pretend that we acknowledge the subjectivity of the animals, but the name they give them a lot of them are names of foods. For instance, pasta, peaches, pesto, you name it. Another example would be, for instance, to call animals grass-fed meat, and basically just completely exclude the animal. So it's very scientific, grass-fed meat. You don't touch any blood, you don't touch anything. So that's kind of like the happy story that you don't need to worry about it.
Yeah. So Natalie, what are you hoping will happen as a result of this article? Are you hoping that people will read the newspaper with more care, or is this more aimed at journalists, asking them to be more considerate? What are you hoping people can do with this information?
Well, we hope several things. In general, for people, we want people to know that speciesism exists, and that it uses language to reproduce the ideology of oppression against non-human animals. And so one thing that they should always think about is whether the story they're reading, or the report they're watching, or you name it, the discourse, the conversation they're following, whether that has instances and examples of camouflage, specifically camouflaged speciesism. So that's one thing. The other thing we want people to know is that speciesism is mutating. And it's mutating because of the power of animal rights activism to put agribusinesses and the animal farming basically in a place, in a position where they have to defend themselves. And as they defend themselves, they create and invent new mechanisms. And as soon as they do that, animal rights activism has to also regroup and figure out how to address that new type of deception that they're putting out there. For instance, that doesn't have really much to do with our articles, but there has been phenomenal activism against labs. And so what now universities and research facilities have started to do is to build labs underground where animal rights activism activists cannot even go, let alone probably even know that it exists in that particular facility. And go ahead.
Yeah, great. Well, hey people, it's Siobhan here, just dropping in very quickly before we hear the 5 quick questions. Now, have you heard of the Tiny Beam Fund? If you haven't, you should have heard of them, and you're going to hear a lot more about them into the future. The Tiny Beam Fund is a US-based charity that exists for the purpose of encouraging and perhaps most importantly funding rigorous academic research looking at industrialized agriculture, specifically factory farming. And even more specifically, they're interested in critically evaluating and considering factory farming in middle and low income countries. But they've got a broad charter to cast a critical rigorously academic eye over factory farming in all its guises. Now, they currently have a grants program open. Grants are open now, and applications close on October 11th, 2019. You can apply for up to $10,000 to support your research endeavours. I have had a small grant from the wonderful people at the Tiny Beam Fund, and I really encourage you to go and check out their work and think about making a funding application. I can remember a time when it seemed almost impossible to get funds to do research into animal-related issues. And look, here we are, 2019, and we've got the Tiny Beam Fund that exists exclusively to facilitate academic research into intensive animal agriculture. So check them out. That's the Tiny Beam Fund, and their current funding grant falls under the title of the Burning Questions Initiative. Now, you can find a link to their website in the show notes, or you can put Tiny Beam Fund into Google and you'll get there. Get applying. Natalie, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Right, yeah.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yes, absolutely. It was fantastic. It was by John Denayer, and it was her book about speciesism and language. I have so much respect for John Denayer and for her fantastic book. This book has been probably the Bible for me to understand my own research, because I do that exact same type of research. I research different systems of oppression and language. One of them is speciesism.
Wonderful. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
That was Angry Cow, the article we just discussed.
Oh, right. Wonderful. If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
It's very difficult to name one person, and if we exclude John Denayer, who's had tremendous impact on me, I would have to go with my co-author Nuria Almiron, because in my relationship with her, it was a fantastic experience to understand how to be a better advocate through research on behalf of animals. So I want to give another shout out to Nuria Almiron. And she's published a lot of scholarship. She's had a really great career, and recently she published several books. Fantastic scholar. If you are interested, please go ahead and read some of her scholarship.
Wonderful. So what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
I think we should publish research based on animal rights and in support of animal rights, rather than research that may be promoting only animal welfare. And I think we should be publishing prolifically. And I think we should publish prolifically because we want to develop the field to a degree where it would spill in other fields. For instance, if we look at feminism now has spilled, in terms of gender studies, has spilled in almost every field that is related to every field in social sciences and in the humanities. And people who do whatever other research they do acknowledge that gender is a factor, and that is because of feminist studies. I want us to do the exact same thing with species. I want other fields not to be able to write any piece of scholarship without acknowledging the intersectionality between whatever the heck they're working on and speciesism.
Wonderful. If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I would not want us to relate to animals as food. Period. And that would basically take care of every other aspect of oppression to a large degree that we commit against animals.
Well, what are you working on next?
Next, I am co-editing a book with Nuria Almiran called Refugees, Animals, and Multiculturalism. And that book wants to look from multidisciplinary perspective at how multicultural societies deal with issues that have to do with refugees in the recent refugee crisis and also historically. We do that because refugees are the second, after non-human animals, the second refugees as part of immigrants are the second largest group on the globe that is underprivileged and oppressed. Non-humans, of course, are the largest group that is oppressed. A lot of non-humans, and that's one of the things that we want to basically theorize in the book, is that a lot of non-humans are refugees because of loss of habitat due to the climate crisis, due to the human activity, building walls, etc. And so as refugees, we need to theorize them, and we need to change the definition of what counts as refugees. But not only non-humans that suffer losing their habitat, also non-humans that, for instance, are saved from labs or from factory farms or from circuses. They need safe refuge, and in a way they are refugees. And you can even think of those animals that are never get the chance to be saved from labs or factory farms, and they don't grow in their natural environments. In a way, they're kept in detention facilities, and they could be considered also refugees, and not just refugees, but extreme refugees and extreme permanent refugees, because they suffer tremendous suffering, tremendous oppression there, and suffering and abuse, and they never get the chance to actually find a safe haven.
And who's publishing that book?
So far, we almost have a contract with Brill. We have 2 very good interviews, and we are in the final stages of concluding the process.
Right. So everyone can keep an eye out for that. And where can people find out more about your work?
You can always Google me on Google Scholar, for instance. You can Google my co-author as well on Google Scholar, and on academia.com. Is it .com?
Wonderful.
I think it's academia.edu.
.edu.
.edu.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. You can also find us on the internet at Twitter at knowing_animals, or on Facebook at Knowing Animals, or on Instagram at Knowing Animals. Finally, don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.